The planet Cadia was burning before the first alarm ever sounded. That was the part no one could explain afterward, the part that made Inquisitor Gregor Eisenhorn stare at the Auspex readings for 6 full minutes without speaking, because the data suggested something had arrived in the middle of an active war zone without using any known translation method, without warp displacement, without teleportation signature, without a ship, and without so much as disturbing the ash falling from the sky above the trenches. The heretic Astartes warband, designated Black Crusade Splinter Cell Thetavrach, had been pushing the Cadian 8th Regiment back through 3 defensive lines over the course of 11 hours, and then all at once, every Vox channel within a 4-kilometer radius went completely silent, and when communications resumed 47 seconds later, the entire warband had simply ceased to exist. Not rooted, not retreating, ceased. The crater that remained measured 80 meters across and descended 30 meters into the bedrock, as if something had pressed down on that patch of ground with the casual weight of a collapsing star. The surviving guardsmen who were found in the surrounding trenches were physically unharmed, but every single one of them reported the same thing independently, before any of them had the chance to speak to each other. A short, unremarkable man in a white cape had walked through the middle of the battle, looked mildly inconvenienced, and punched once. Whatever this is, wherever it came from, the Imperium of Man has never encountered it before, and that alone should terrify you. If you want to see what happens when a force the Imperium cannot classify, cannot contain, and cannot destroy walks through the most brutal universe ever written, subscribe now, because what comes next is going to permanently change everything you thought you knew about power. The Cadian warzone had been bleeding for 11 months before anyone thought to question the crater. That sounds strange until you understand what the front lines of a Black Crusade splinter engagement actually look like in practice. The Cadian 8th Regiment had been grinding through a landscape that no longer resembled anything a human being would recognize as a planet's surface. The ground itself had been corrupted by prolonged warp exposure during the initial chaos push, and the result was terrain that shifted slightly underfoot when no one was watching, soil that occasionally whispered in languages that predated the Imperium by 10,000 years, and skis that ran a deep arterial red from horizon to horizon regardless of what the local star was doing. Against that backdrop, an 80-meter crater appearing overnight was, frankly, not the most alarming thing that had happened that week. The regimental commissar had logged it as probable demonic detonation and moved on. It was only when a savant attached to the Administratum Surveying Corps ran the blast dispersal calculations 3 weeks later and found that the physics of the crater were completely impossible for any known explosive, demonic, or psychic event, that anyone stopped moving long enough to think carefully about what they were looking at. The savant's name was Proctor Edvan Thessaly, and she was not a dramatic person by nature. She had spent 14 years cataloging warzone aftermath data for the Departamento Munitorum, which meant she had seen enough destruction to become deeply unimpressed by most of it. But she sat with the crater calculations for a long time, and then she wrote a single line in her formal report that would eventually be forwarded all the way to an inquisitorial conclave on Scintilla. The force vector indicates a single point of downward impact, manually applied, origin unknown. That line was what finally made Inquisitor Gregor Eisenhorn look up from his other cases and pay attention. Because Eisenhorn had spent the better part of a century investigating every category of Xeno's threat, chaos incursion, and rogue psyker phenomenon that the Calixis sector could produce, and he knew exactly what manually applied meant in a context like this one. It meant something had punched the ground. The question was what, and more importantly, where it had gone afterward. The answer to the second question came from a guardsman named Davin Krast, who had been stationed in Forward Trench Gamma 9 on the night in question, and who had not filed a report because he had been medically sedated for 3 days following the incident, and had then spent 2 more weeks quietly hopping that what he remembered was a hallucination. He finally told his platoon sergeant because the memory was interfering with his ability to sleep, and the story worked its way up the chain of command with the slow, grinding inevitability of imperial bureaucracy until it reached someone who understood what they were hearing. What Krast described was this. The heretic Astartes had broken through the third defensive line and were moving through the trench system in force. 8 Chaos Space Marines in corrupted MKIV armor. One of them, a champion bearing a weapon Krast described only as something that was also a mouth, and the guardsmen around him had broken and run, because when Chaos Space Marines breach your trench at close quarters, there is no doctrine that says stand your ground. There is only the biological imperative to be somewhere else. Krast had fallen behind because his boot had caught on a communications cable, and he had turned around flat on his back in the mud, expecting to see the champion standing over him. Instead, he saw a man walking through the gap in the barricade from the opposite direction, coming from no man's land, completely alone, wearing what Krast repeatedly described as a white cape or coat that should have been filthy given the conditions but wasn't, carrying no visible weapons, and moving at a pace that could only be described as a person who has somewhere to be but does not consider it urgent. The Chaos Champion had turned toward this man. The champion was 3.5 meters tall in corrupted Terminator-adjacent plate and radiated the kind of psychic malice that made unprotected humans' noses bleed from 20 meters away. The man in the white cape had looked at the champion with an expression Krast struggled to articulate for several minutes before settling on like when you see a long line at the grocery store. And then the man had punched once, and Krast had woken up in the medici tent. That description, the grocery store line, was the detail that lodged in Eisenhorn's mind and refused to leave. He had interrogated Krast personally via hololithic link from his vessel in the scintilla system, and he had watched the guardsman's face carefully while the man searched for words, and he had come to a professional conclusion that Krast was not fabricating, was not suffering from chaos-induced delusion, and was not embellishing. The man believed every word he was saying. More troublingly, 3 other guardsmen from adjacent trenches had given independent accounts that placed an unidentified figure moving through the battlefield in the same window of time, all of them describing a short, unremarkable human male moving without urgency through an active combat zone, and none of them able to explain why they had not been killed by either side during the period in question. The Chaos Marines had apparently not engaged the figure after the initial contact. The surviving elements of the warband, there were none. There were no survivors. The entire 37-member heretic Astartes splinter cell had been annihilated in under a minute. Eisenhorn requested full jurisdiction over the crater site and surrounding territory under inquisitorial seal within 6 hours of reviewing the compiled witness accounts. He also sent a secondary communique to a colleague he trusted, a woman named Elizabeth Bequin who had a particular talent for identifying things that did not fit any known category, because that was precisely the problem he was facing. The Imperium of Man had threat classification systems that had been refined and expanded over 10,000 years of warfare against every conceivable form of hostile entity in the galaxy. Chaos, Xenos, Mutant, Rogue Psyker, Demon, Blank, Pariah. Every configuration of threat had been seen, cataloged, and responded to. What it did not have, in any of its 14,000 official threat designation subcategories, was a classification for a lone individual in a white coat who walked through an active warzone looking bored and reduced a full complement of Chaos Space Marines to a crater with 1 punch, while apparently sustaining 0 injuries, and then simply continued walking in a direction that Eisenhorn's Auspex team was still trying to determine 3 weeks after the fact. He was out there somewhere on Cadia, or had moved on to somewhere else, and the trail was already cold, and the Inquisition's most fundamental operating principle was that anything powerful enough to leave no survivors and no explanation was powerful enough to be a threat to the Imperium's survival, and therefore could not be left unclassified, uncontrolled, and unobserved. Eisenhorn was already moving. He did not yet know that by the time he found what he was looking for, a second incident would have already occurred, on a different world, 3 sectors away, and that the second crater would be larger than the first one by a factor that would make his savant team go very quiet for a very long time. The planet Tarsai's Ultra was not a war zone when Saitama arrived, which was precisely what made the second incident so much harder for the Imperium to process. Cadia had been a battlefield, and battlefields produced anomalies. Explosions misfired, warp energies discharged unpredictably. Chaos champions occasionally destroyed each other in territorial disputes that the Imperium's intelligence services misattributed to friendly fire. There were explanations available, even if none of them fit the crater perfectly, and the human mind is remarkably good at reaching for an imperfect explanation when the alternative is accepting that something genuinely unprecedented has occurred. Tarsai's Ultra offered no such comfort. It was a hive world, densely populated, relatively stable by the grim standards of the 41st millennium, its PDF forces competent, and its manufactorum output considered strategically important to 3 surrounding subsectors. It had no active war zone. It had no chaos incursion in progress. What it had on the 43rd day after the Cadian incident was a Tyranid splinter fleet that had been moving through the outer system for approximately 6 weeks and had finally resolved into a full-scale planetary assault. And what happened next was the thing that caused Inquisitor Eisenhorn, reading the after-action Vox transcripts on his ship's command deck, to sit down slowly in his chair and not stand up again for 40 minutes. The Tyranid assault had made planetfall in 3 waves across the northern hemisphere, which was standard hive fleet doctrine for a world of Tarsai's Ultra's size and population density. The first wave was bioforms, the chittering advanced screen of termagants and hormagaunts that stripped away defensive positions and forced the PDF into reactive engagements while the larger organisms positioned themselves. The second wave brought the carnifexes, the living siege engines of the Tyranid swarm, organisms that massed upward of 8 tons and were capable of dismantling reinforced ferrocrete fortifications with their bare claws without meaningfully slowing down. The Tarsai's Ultra PDF had 12 artillery positions covering the northern approach and a full regiment of armored vehicles staged in the industrial outskirts of Hive Secundus, and the tactical assessment filed by PDF Commander Reavasunth at the start of the engagement was professionally measured but clearly anticipated significant losses before orbital support could be requested and granted. She was operating within her doctrine. She was doing everything correctly. And then the Vox traffic simply stopped making sense. What the transcripts recorded, cross-referenced against sensor logs that Eisenhorn's team spent 2 days verifying for tampering before accepting as genuine, was this: approximately 4 hours into the engagement, when the second wave had penetrated the outer defensive perimeter and the PDF was beginning its organized withdrawal toward the inner hive, the swarm advance suddenly halted. Not slowed, halted. Every bioform within a 6-kilometer radius of what the sensors tagged as grid reference Sunth 7 went still simultaneously, which was a thing that Tyranid swarms did not do, because the hive mind did not pause and did not hesitate, and did not stop to evaluate threats in the way that individual organisms did. The hive mind absorbed information at a rate that made hesitation functionally meaningless. And yet the swarm stopped for 11 seconds, which in the context of a Tyranid planetary assault was an eternity, and then every bioform in that 6-kilometer radius was killed within the following 3 minutes, and then the rest of the swarm, the portions that had made planetfall in the eastern and western landing zones, reversed course and began moving back toward the sea. The hive fleet, according to the orbital auger arrays, began its retreat from the system within the hour. Commander Sunth had filed her report with shaking hands, and the report contained a passage that Eisenhorn read 4 times before he trusted himself to continue. She wrote that her forward scouts, pushing cautiously into the zone of Tyranid destruction after the swarm withdrawal began, had found the area cleared of bioforms, but had also found, walking calmly through the debris field of shattered chitin and ichor, a single human male of average height and unremarkable appearance, dressed in dark clothing with what appeared to be a white outer garment, who had looked at the scouts with an expression of mild curiosity and asked them, in what her scouts described as completely normal Gothic low, whether there was anywhere nearby that sold groceries, because he had been walking for what felt like a long time and he was a little hungry. The scouts had not known what to do with this information. Their sergeant had, apparently, pointed toward the hive city, and the man had thanked him politely and continued walking in that direction. He had not explained anything. He had not claimed responsibility for anything. He had not seemed aware that an explanation was expected. The sergeant had filed a supplementary note to Commander Sunth's report describing the man's demeanor as not aggressive, not threatening, seemed kind of tired. That supplementary note was, from Eisenhorn's perspective, almost more disturbing than the annihilation of an entire Tyranid assault wave, because it meant the entity was not operating with any apparent awareness of the scale of what it was doing. A weapon that knew it was a weapon could be reasoned with, could be offered purpose or direction, could potentially be controlled. Whatever this was, it was not behaving like a weapon. It was behaving like a person who had somewhere to be, and kept finding conflict in the way. Eisenhorn sent 3 messages within the same hour. The first was to his inquisitorial superior, a curt summary of both incidents with a threat classification recommendation of undesignated extreme priority, which was not an official category, but which he felt accurately communicated the situation. The second was to Magos Biologas Tichan on Styges VIII, requesting a full analysis of the bioform destruction patterns from the Tarsai's Ultra incident, specifically focused on whether the damage signatures were consistent with any known Xenos weapon system, psychic event, or natural phenomenon. The third was to the only Space Marine chapter master he trusted enough to contact directly, a man named Cato Sicarius of the Ultramarines, because Eisenhorn had reached the private conclusion that whatever he was tracking, he was going to need significantly more firepower available than the Inquisition's standard acolyte cadres could provide. Not to destroy it, necessarily. Simply to ensure that, when he found it and approached it, the conversation happened on terms where the Imperium had options. What he did not yet know was that Saitama, walking through the outskirts of Hive Secundus and squinting at a row of what appeared to be vendor stalls, had found something that looked approximately like a convenience store, had purchased what passed for a meat bun in the 41st millennium, had found it acceptable but not as good as the ones back home, and had then sat down on a piece of rubble to eat it while watching the Hive City's enormous Gothic spires catch the late afternoon light. Thinking that this place was strange and confusing and that he still had no idea how he'd gotten here, but that the sky was kind of interesting if you didn't think too hard about why it was red. He was not hiding. He was not planning anything. He was just sitting there, and the swarm that had retreated from the system was already reporting back to the hive mind through synaptic channels, and what it was reporting had caused a flicker of something in the hive mind's vast distributed consciousness that the Tyranid species had not experienced in its entire multi-million-year evolutionary history. Not threat assessment, something older and more instinctive than that. The hive mind had looked at Saitama through 11,000 bioform sensory organs simultaneously and felt, for 11 seconds, genuinely uncertain whether it wanted to continue. It had decided it did not. The formal threat classification meeting was held aboard the inquisitorial black ship Sword of Cogitation in high orbit above Scintilla, and it lasted 9 hours, which was unusually long even by the standards of an institution that had elevated deliberation to something approaching religious practice. Eisenhorn had called the conclave himself, invoking his authority as a senior inquisitor of the Ordo Xenos, and the attendees represented a cross-section of the Inquisition's available expertise in the sector. Ordo Xenos, obviously, because the entity had thus far appeared in contexts involving Chaos Marines and Tyranids, and had interacted with both in ways that defied conventional analysis. But also Ordo Malleus representation, because the warp implications could not be ignored, and a single Ordo Hereticus observer named Inquisitor Laertian Vosk, who had been added at the last moment because someone in the Conclave's administrative chain had noticed that the entity spoke Low Gothic fluently, and thought this warranted a heresy investigator's perspective. Vosk had spent the first 3 hours of the meeting looking extremely skeptical, and then Eisenhorn had shown him the full sensor analysis from Tarsai's Ultra, and Vosk had spent the remaining 6 hours looking like a man reassessing several of his foundational assumptions about the universe. The core problem, which Eisenhorn laid out in the meeting's opening hour with the precise, economical language of someone who had been thinking about nothing else for 6 weeks, was classification. The Imperium of Man ran on classification. Every resource allocation decision, every military deployment, every strategic priority was downstream of the Threat Classification Index, a document so vast and so regularly amended that its current edition required a dedicated data stack on every inquisitorial vessel large enough to carry one. The index had categories for everything. It had subcategories within categories, and sub-subcategories within those, and special exception clauses for entities that crossed categorical boundaries, and emergency reclassification protocols for threats that evolved faster than the index could be updated. What it did not have, and what the Conclave spent its first 3 hours confirming that it did not have, was any category that accommodated a lone humanoid entity that had annihilated a Chaos Space Marine warband and a Tyranid assault wave on separate worlds in separate incidents, apparently through application of unaided physical force, sustained 0 observable damage in both encounters, and then attempted to purchase food. The food purchase was the detail that kept derailing the technical discussions, because it implied metabolism, which implied biological normalcy, which implied the entity had physical needs and limitations consistent with baseline humanity, which was completely irreconcilable with everything else the data said about what it had done. Magos Biologist Tichan's analysis of the Tarsai's ultra-bioform destruction patterns had arrived that morning, and the relevant section of the report was the part Eisenhorn had read aloud to the Conclave, because he wanted every person in the room to hear it in the same moment. The damage signatures were consistent with extreme kinetic force applied at a single point and radiating outward in a pattern that matched no known weapon system, no psychic discharge event, and no naturally occurring phenomenon in the Imperium's records, but which, if scaled down to the level of a single organism, was structurally identical to blunt impact trauma. Something had hit them, very hard, once each in the cases where individual damage signatures could be isolated. The Carnifex-class organisms had required approximately the same single impact to destroy as the smaller bioforms. The force differential between the two outcomes, if applied by the same source, implied a level of physical strength that Tichan had declined to quantify because, as he noted in the report with what Eisenhorn recognized as scientific distress, the number produced by his calculations was not a number that belonged in a document intended to be taken seriously. The Ordo Malleus representative, a gaunt woman named Inquisitor Saravina Crane, who had spent 40 years investigating demonic incursions, raised the warp question at the meeting's 4-hour mark. She had been reviewing parallel data that her office maintained, the kind of broad-spectrum warp activity, monitoring that the Ordo Malleus conducted continuously across every major psychic beacon and Geller field relay in the sector. And she had found something that she presented to the conclave with the careful, measured tone of someone who had decided in advance that she was going to present this calmly regardless of what happened internally when she did. In the 43 days between the Cadian incident and the Tarsai's Ultra incident, there had been a series of micro-fluctuations in the warp's background activity across a corridor of space that connected the two worlds. Not large fluctuations, not the kind of warp storm signatures that triggered emergency protocols. Small ones, the kind of readings that would normally be attributed to routine psychic background noise and filtered out of active monitoring reports. Except that when Crane's analysts plotted them geographically and temporally against the two known incidents, the fluctuations formed a line, a path, consistent with something moving between the two locations at a speed that she declined to calculate for the same reason Tzeentch had declined to quantify the force numbers. And the nature of the fluctuations was not consistent with a warp-active entity moving through real space. It was the opposite. The readings looked like the warp was reacting to something that was not part of it passing through the space adjacent to it, like a river reacting to a stone that refused to get wet. That image, the stone that refused to get wet, was the one that stuck with Eisenhorn afterward, because it was the most accurate description he had encountered yet of what they were apparently dealing with. Every force in the galaxy that operated at the scale this entity seemed to operate at was either a part of the warp or deeply entangled with it. The chaos gods drew power from it. Demons were made of it. Even the Emperor's light, the psychic beacon of the astronomicon that held the Imperium together across the stars, was a warp phenomenon. The idea of something operating at that scale of physical power while remaining entirely outside the warp's influence was not just unusual. It was, by the Imperium's theological and scientific framework simultaneously, supposed to be impossible. Eisenhorn left the conclave with 3 operational mandates approved by consensus. First, a Deathwatch kill team was to be deployed to Tarsai's Ultra immediately to pick up the entity's trail from the last confirmed sighting location, with standing orders to observe, track, and under no circumstances engage, unless the entity demonstrated hostile intent toward Imperial citizens. The distinction was important, and Eisenhorn had argued for it specifically, because the data suggested that hostile intent was not a feature of the entity's behavior pattern, and the Deathwatch's default operational mode was lethal engagement. And he had a strong professional intuition that sending heavily armed space marines after something that had just casually destroyed a Tyranid assault wave, and then gone looking for a snack, was not a situation where lethal engagement was going to produce useful outcomes. Second, a full Mechanicus Auspex team was to establish monitoring stations along the projected path between the two known incident sites, attempting to detect the warp-adjacent fluctuation signature before the next incident rather than after. Third, and most delicately, a communication protocol was to be drafted for the possibility of direct contact, because the entity had spoken Low Gothic. It had spoken it fluently and casually and without apparent effort. Which meant, whatever else it was, it could be talked to. The question of what you said to something like this, how you opened a conversation with a being that had just ended a Tyranid planetary invasion as an apparent inconvenience, and was now eating a meat bun in the ruins of a PDF defensive perimeter, was one that none of the 9 Inquisitors present had an immediate answer for. But the protocol needed to exist before they found it, because Eisenhorn's instinct, the instinct that had kept him alive for over a century in the most dangerous investigative role the Imperium offered, told him clearly that when they did find it, they were not going to have a lot of time to decide what to say. He was right about that. He just did not know yet that the entity was currently 3 sectors closer than any of their projections suggested, or that it had found something on the road between Tarsai's Ultra and wherever it was going that had caught its attention long enough to stop walking, or that the thing it had stopped to look at was the beginning of a Black Crusade offensive that the Imperium's entire northern defense network had been trying to contain for 8 months without success. The Obscurus Offensive, as the Imperial Strategic Command had taken to calling it in their internal briefings, had been the most sustained chaos push in the northern sectors in over 2 centuries, and by the time Saitama wandered into the middle of it, it had already consumed 4 worlds, a naval battle group, and the better part of 3 space marine companies across 6 months of continuous fighting. The strategic picture, as it existed at the moment Saitama crested a ridge on the agri-world Solace Tertius and stood looking down at what was happening in the valley below him, was this. A force of approximately 12,000 Chaos Space Marines drawn from 3 warbands operating under loose coordination by a Chaos Lord named Vorkin, the Unbroken had established a bridgehead across Solace Tertius's primary landmass, and the Imperial counter-response had been a combined arms operation involving 2 Astra Militarum regiments, a company of the Iron Hand Space Marine chapter, and a Titan from the Legio Metallica that had been diverted from a completely separate campaign and whose princeps was reportedly furious about it. The battle had been ongoing for 19 days. The Titan alone should have been sufficient to break the Chaos bridgehead within 72 hours of its arrival, but Vorkin, the Unbroken, had anticipated this and had brought with him 3 Daemon Engines, massive corruption-fueled war machines that occupied roughly the same battlefield role as Imperial Titans, but were sustained by warp energy rather than conventional plasma reactors. And the resulting engagement between the Titan and the Daemon Engines had been grinding and terrible, and had covered a significant portion of the valley floor in wreckage from both sides. The Legio Metallica Titan, and warlord-class machine named Bellum Eternus, was still operational but had sustained damage to its void shield generators and its left-arm weapons system, and its princeps had been fighting it essentially as an enormous gun platform for the past 6 days while her tech priests worked to restore mobility. The situation was, in the language of Imperial military assessments, deteriorating in an acceptable but concerning manner. Saitama stood on the ridge and looked at all of this for a while. He looked at the Titan, which was the first thing that had genuinely gotten his attention since arriving in this universe, because it was very large and he found large things intermittently interesting. He looked at the Daemon Engines, which were roughly Titan-sized themselves, and which were currently exchanging fire with Bellum Eternus across a ruined agricultural processing facility. He looked at the ground battle happening across the valley floor, thousands of soldiers in 2 different color schemes shooting at each other amid the wreckage of what had probably been farmland before any of this started. He scratched the back of his head and thought, without any particular urgency, that this was another one of those situations that kept happening in this place, where a lot of people were fighting very hard and nobody seemed to be winning, and that was a little depressing honestly. Back home he would have known whose side to be on because the bad guys usually had a cleaner visual profile. Here, everyone looked fairly terrible. He was about to continue walking when one of the Daemon Engine's weapons batteries discharged in a direction that swept across the ridge he was standing on, not targeting him specifically, but covering the area as part of a suppression arc. And the blast caught the ground approximately 30 meters to his left and threw a considerable amount of former farmland into the air. Saitama looked at the dirt raining down around him. He looked at the Daemon Engine that had fired. He sighed, which was a sound no one in the valley could hear at that distance, and then he jumped off the ridge. The jump covered approximately 1 kilometer of horizontal distance and dropped him directly onto the first Daemon Engine, which was a Defiler-class machine standing 11 meters tall and massing several hundred tons, and he landed on its upper hull with the kind of sound that made every sensor array in the valley spike simultaneously, and made the Titan Princeps Myra Solander look up sharply from her tactical display, and say, very quietly, what was that? The Defiler registered the impact on its hull sensors and began its targeting rotation to deal with whatever had landed on it, which was a process that took approximately 3 seconds for a machine of its size. And Saitama used that time to look around at the battle from his new elevated position and confirm that yes, the machines were definitely the problem here. And then he punched downward through the defiler's upper carapace with enough force that the machine did not explode so much as it was pressed into the ground. All 11 meters of chaos-corrupted demon-possessed war machine, driven straight down into the agri-world's bedrock, as if someone had decided it belonged underground rather than on the surface. The second Daemon Engine, a soul grinder variant that had been advancing toward the Titan's damaged flank, stopped moving. The third, positioned on the eastern ridge line providing artillery support, also stopped. This was not a tactical decision made by their operators in the conventional sense, because Daemon Engines did not have operators in the conventional sense. They were possessed machines sustained by the will of bound demons. But the demons that animated them were warp-touched entities with senses that extended beyond the physical. And what they had just experienced was not a military threat that could be processed through tactical calculation. It was something that made the warp stuff they were made of feel suddenly and profoundly wrong about being in this location. The soul grinder moved first, not toward Saitama but away, lurching backward with the jerky, graceless movement of a machine whose possessing demon was overriding its weapon systems in favor of immediate distance. The artillery Daemon Engine simply stopped firing and went very still in a way that suggested internal conflict between its demon's instincts and whatever remained of its mechanical programming. Saitama stepped off the crater where the defiler had been and landed in the valley floor. The ground battle around him had developed a circular absence of activity, a rough sphere of roughly 200 meters in every direction where both Chaos Space Marines and Imperial Guardsmen had independently decided that whatever was happening at the center of that sphere was not something they needed to be adjacent to right now. The Iron Hands Space Marines had not retreated, because Iron Hands did not retreat from things they hadn't evaluated yet, but the sergeant commanding the company's forward elements, a veteran named Sergeant Cadmus Vreth, whose bionic left arm was currently tracking Saitama with the auspex built into its palm, had issued a standfast order and was watching very carefully. Vreth had been a space marine for 60 years and had fought on 43 worlds, and he did not, as a professional matter, experience surprise. He was experiencing something adjacent to it now, which he privately categorized as recalibration, and which manifested as an extremely focused stillness. Vorkin the Unbroken had received the news of his defiler's destruction through the psychic shriek of the bound demon's death in the warp, which was the kind of communication that bypassed every conventional communication system and arrived directly in his nervous system as a sensation somewhere between agony and revelation. He was a man who had fought for 300 years in the service of Chaos Undivided, who had personally killed 2 Space Marine captains and a Grey Knight Justicar, who wore armor permanently fused to his body by 8 decades of chaos corruption, and who had not felt uncertainty since the early years of his 2nd century of life. He felt something now that required several seconds to identify because it was so unfamiliar. He sent 3 of his best warriors toward the center of the valley, not because he expected them to win, but because he needed information. The 3 Chaos Space Marines moved toward Saitama from the north with the measured, aggressive confidence of beings who had never encountered anything they could not eventually destroy. And Saitama watched them come with the expression that Davin Krast had described on Cadia, that grocery store line expression. And then they reached him, and the engagement lasted approximately 4 seconds, and afterward there were 3 more craters in the valley floor, and Saitama was brushing dust off his sleeve. Princeps Myra Solander, watching from Bellum Eternus's command deck through the Titan's sensor array, turned to her Moderati and said that she needed someone to get her an open channel to Imperial Command right now, and she needed to tell them that the situation on Solace Tertius had changed, and not in any way that was covered by her briefing documents. Sergeant Vreth sent his own communication simultaneously. A priority Vox burst to the Iron Hands chapter fleet in orbit, flagged at the highest urgency code he had authority to use, containing 3 sentences. Unknown entity active in Valley. Destroyed 3 Daemon Engines, 3 Chaos Astartes, time elapsed under 5 minutes. Recommend immediate inquisitorial notification. The Chaos Warband's advance had stopped completely. Vorkin the Unbroken had pulled his forces back to the bridgehead, and was standing in his command position looking at his tactical displays with the expression of a man who was recalculating something fundamental. And Saitama was standing in the middle of the valley looking at the remaining soul grinder, which had retreated to a distance of about 600 meters and was now stationary, and thinking that this was like the ones from earlier except bigger, and wondering if hitting it would actually be satisfying or if it would just be the same as everything else lately. He decided to leave it. He had things to do. He wasn't entirely sure what they were, but he was fairly confident there was somewhere in this general direction that might have better food than the last place. The Deathwatch kill team had been tracking Saitama for 11 days before they found him, and the finding was not the difficult part. The difficult part was what happened after. Kill Team Obsidian was a 7-member unit drawn from 5 different Space Marine chapters, assembled specifically for this mission under the operational authority of Watch Captain Aldrich Sten, a Blood Angels veteran who had served in the Death Watch for 30 years and who had been selected by Eisenhorn personally on the basis of his record in Xeno's threat evaluation, which was extensive, and his demonstrated capacity for restraint in ambiguous contact situations, which was rarer in Space Marines than the Inquisition would have preferred. The team's composition reflected the assessment that this mission required observation and potential communication before any consideration of combat, so Sten had been given a librarian, Brother Ezekiel of the Dark Angels, whose psychic senses could operate as a detection and analysis tool, and had been told explicitly and in writing that lethal engagement was a last resort authorization that required Sten's direct command and could not be initiated unilaterally by any team member regardless of perceived threat level. Every member of the kill team had acknowledged this order. Most of them had done so with the particular kind of professional compliance that suggested they understood the order intellectually, while privately reserving judgment about whether they would follow it if events became sufficiently extreme. They picked up Saitama's trail from the Solace Tertius Valley, where the evidence of his passage was fairly straightforward to interpret once you accepted the premise that a single individual had done all of it. From there, the trail moved in a direction that initially seemed random, and then, over several days of analysis, appeared to be driven by something close to curiosity. The entity was moving toward population centers rather than away from them, which was the opposite of what a hostile threat would do, and the same as what a lost person would do, and it was stopping in settlements long enough to eat and rest before moving on, which the tracking data confirmed through the minor but measurable evidence of vendor interactions, disturbed sleeping positions in abandoned structures. And on one memorable occasion, a partially consumed food item left on a roadside that Sten's apothecary had analyzed and confirmed was approximately 4 hours old at time of discovery. They were close. They had been close for 3 days, always arriving at a location hours after the entity had moved on, and Sten had begun to suspect that the entity simply moved faster than their tracking timeline accounted for, and that their projections needed to be pushed forward, not back. Brother Ezekiel found him first, which was not a surprise because Ezekiel's psychic senses extended considerably further than conventional detection methods. But the way Ezekiel found him was a surprise, because what the librarian reported was not a psychic signature, but the absence of one. He described it to Sten during their approach as a silence, a place where the background psychic noise of the world simply was not, a gap in the warp's ambient presence shaped roughly like a human being, and moving at a walking pace along the road ahead of them. Sten had asked whether this was consistent with a blank or pariah, entities whose anti-psychic nature created similar silences, and Ezekiel had been quiet for a moment before saying that a blank felt like a hole. This felt like something that the warp had decided not to touch, which was a different thing entirely and considerably more unsettling from a theoretical standpoint. They came around a bend in the road, and there he was, average height, unremarkable build, white cape over dark clothing, both in better condition than they had any right to be given the environments the entity had been moving through. He was sitting on a low wall at the roadside, eating something wrapped in paper that appeared to be some variety of local street food, and he looked up when the 7 Space Marines in black Deathwatch armor came around the bend, and his expression moved through a brief sequence that Sten, watching carefully, categorized as mild interest at the sound, recognition that the approaching figures were very large, assessment that this was probably another situation, and then a settling into something that could only be described as resigned patience. He did not stand up. He did not drop the food. He looked at them with the attentive calm of a man who has been approached by large things before and has developed a consistent policy for handling it. Sten stopped the kill team at 20 meters and stepped forward alone to 5 meters, because the contact protocol Eisenhorn had drafted specified that initial approach should be non-threatening and involve the fewest possible armed individuals, and Sten had decided that 5 meters was close enough to communicate clearly and far enough to give everyone time to think if something went wrong. He identified himself by name and chapter and operational authority. He stated that he represented an organization with jurisdiction over this sector, and that he had questions he hoped the entity would be willing to answer. He spoke in low Gothic, clearly and without aggression, because the protocol specified that matching the entity's demonstrated language was the highest priority communication tool available. And then he waited. Saitama finished the last bite of his food, folded the paper with the automatic neatness of someone who had grown up in a place with litter ordinances, and looked at Sten. He said, in perfectly serviceable low Gothic, with an accent that Sten's centuries of experience could not place to any known regional dialect, that he had a question too, actually, and his question was whether Sten knew how he might get back home, because he had been walking for what seemed like a very long time and nothing here looked familiar, and he was starting to think he might have gotten turned around somewhere. Sten processed this for a moment. He said carefully that he was not immediately certain what home the entity was referring to, and asked if the entity could describe it. Saitama described Z-City, which meant nothing to Sten, and the Hero Association, which meant nothing to Sten, and a specific apartment that cost 4,900 yen a month, which also meant nothing to Sten. And then Saitama looked at Sten's expression and said that Sten didn't know any of those things, did he? Sten confirmed that he did not. Saitama said in the tone of someone adding a data point to an ongoing calculation, and then asked if Sten was one of the soldiers who kept fighting each other everywhere, or one of the different ones. Sten said that he was different, relatively speaking. Saitama said that was good. He was getting tired of the fighting each other everywhere ones. Sten asked if the entity would be willing to come with him to speak with someone who had more information about the region and might be able to help with his situation. Saitama said that depended on whether the person he was being taken to was going to try to fight him or try to help him, because, in his experience lately, it had been about 90% the former. Sten said, with the honest directness of a man who had decided that honesty was his best available tool, that he could not guarantee there would be no conflict, but that conflict was not the intent, and that he personally was going to do everything in his authority to prevent it. Saitama looked at him for a long moment with the specific evaluating expression of someone who had gotten good at reading people by being disappointed by them regularly, and then said, "Okay, fine." Brother Ezekiel, standing at the rear of the kill team formation, sent a tightly encrypted psychic communication to Watch Captain Sten that bypassed Vox channels entirely. "Captain, I am standing next to the most powerful thing I have ever been in proximity to, and it has no psychic signature whatsoever, and I do not know what that means, but I need you to know I am telling you this." Sten received the message, filed it carefully in the section of his mind reserved for information he needed to remember but could not currently act on, and turned to walk back toward the kill team, gesturing for Saitama to follow. Saitama got up from the wall, tucked the folded food wrapper into a pocket, and fell into step behind him with the comfortable, unhurried gait of someone who had decided that going along with this was easier than the alternative and who had, for the moment, set aside the question of what the alternative would actually have been. Behind them in the middle distance, the soul grinder that had been following Saitama's trail at a cautious distance since Solace stopped moving entirely, and then slowly, silently, turned around and went the other way. Sten's rear scouts logged this without comment. There would be time to think about what it meant later. For now, the contact had been made, the entity was cooperating, and Eisenhorn was going to need to be told immediately. The Inquisitor had been right about one thing with absolute certainty. When the moment arrived, there had been very little time to decide what to say. Eisenhorn had prepared for this meeting the way he prepared for everything, methodically, thoroughly, and with a privately held suspicion that his preparation was going to turn out to be inadequate in ways he couldn't predict. The location was a converted Medici facility on the outskirts of a mid-sized settlement on the agri-world Delos IV, chosen because it was defensible, because it had no strategic value that would make it a target for the ongoing Chaos Offensive, and because it was sufficiently far from any major population center that whatever happened during the meeting would have a limited blast radius in both the literal and political sense. Eisenhorn had arrived 3 days before Sten's kill team, and had spent that time having the facility swept for surveillance devices, establishing a perimeter with his acolyte cadre, and reviewing every piece of data. The conclave had assembled on the entity with the focused intensity of a man who understood that he was about to have the most important conversation of his career, and possibly of his century. He had also, on the second day, spent 4 hours simply sitting with the data and trying to imagine what it felt like to be the thing he was about to meet. Not as a psychological manipulation exercise, though it was that too, but as a genuine attempt at understanding, because Eisenhorn's investigative philosophy had always held that the most important thing you could know about any entity was what it wanted, and so far the data suggested this entity wanted to go home, was confused about why it couldn't, and kept intervening in large-scale conflicts with the casual reflexive quality of someone who had simply done this so many times that it had become an automatic response to a certain category of stimulus. That last point was the one that Eisenhorn found most useful and most unsettling in equal measure, because it implied a history. Whatever this thing was, it had not always been this powerful. Something had happened to make it what it was, a process of development that had produced this particular combination of absolute physical capability and complete psychological normalcy. And the fact that the psychological normalcy had survived the development process intact was either the most fortunate aspect of the entire situation or the most dangerous, depending on factors he didn't yet understand. Sten's kill team arrived at dusk on the third day. Eisenhorn watched through the facility's exterior sensors as the Black Rhino transports came through the perimeter checkpoint, and then he watched the feed from the vehicle's external camera as the entity climbed out of the second transport and stood in the courtyard looking around at the facility's exterior with the alert, mildly curious expression of someone arriving at a new place and taking an inventory of it. He was shorter than Eisenhorn had expected somehow, even knowing the witness descriptions. The white cape was exactly as reported. He stood in the courtyard for a moment, and then looked directly at the exterior sensor node that Eisenhorn was watching through, not as if he had detected the surveillance, but as if he had simply noticed an interesting piece of equipment in the direction he happened to be looking. And Eisenhorn had the unsettling experience of feeling observed by something that was not observing him. He met the entity in the facility's main briefing room, which had been stripped of everything except 2 chairs and a table, because Eisenhorn had decided that the environment should be as unambiguous as possible. He brought no weapons that were visible, though he had several that were not, and he brought no acolytes into the room because he had concluded privately that if things went wrong in this room, acolytes were not going to change the outcome. He was accompanied only by Elizabeth Bequin, who sat to his right and whose particular talent, her anti-psychic presence, he wanted in the room for reasons he had not fully articulated even to himself. Perhaps because, facing something that the warp refused to touch, he wanted someone beside him who represented a different kind of refusal. Saitama came into the room, looked at the 2 chairs, looked at Eisenhorn, and sat down in the chair across the table with the cooperative ease of someone who had been told this was the thing to do and was doing it. He put his hands on the table. He waited. Eisenhorn introduced himself fully, name, title, organization, mandate, and the entity listened to all of it with polite attention that suggested he was following the words but not necessarily tracking all of the institutional context. When Eisenhorn finished, the entity said his name was Saitama, just Saitama, and that he was a hero from a place called Earth, and that he had no idea how he had ended up here, but it had happened very suddenly and he was hopping to find a way back. Eisenhorn noted the word hero with the careful attention of a man who stored every piece of data for later analysis, asked what being a hero meant in practical terms where Saitama came from, and received an explanation that he spent the next several minutes internally processing while maintaining an expression of neutral attentiveness. Saitama explained that he had trained very hard for a long time and had become strong enough to defeat any enemy with one punch, which had turned out to be more of a problem than he expected because nothing was challenging anymore, and he had registered with an official organization that dispatched him to handle threats too large for normal people to manage. He described this with the flat, slightly tired honesty of someone who has told this story before and no longer expects it to land the way it did the first time. Eisenhorn asked, very carefully, what the strongest thing Saitama had encountered before arriving here had been. Saitama thought about this genuinely, which meant he was not performing consideration but actually sorting through memories, and said there had been a few. A monster that could destroy planets, a being that called itself a god of destruction. He listed 2 or 3 others with the tone of someone recounting mildly interesting but ultimately unresolved experiences, and Eisenhorn listened and felt the shape of the problem clarify in a way that was simultaneously illuminating and deeply alarming, because what Saitama was describing was a personal history of escalating encounters with existential-level threats, each of which had been resolved by the same mechanism, and not one of which had apparently presented a genuine challenge. The boredom was not affectation. It was the inevitable psychological result of being the most powerful thing in any room you had ever stood in, for long enough that the novelty had fully worn off. Bequin passed Eisenhorn a written note that said simply, "He's telling the truth." She had a talent for recognizing deception that went beyond training, and Eisenhorn trusted it completely. He looked at the note and then looked at Saitama, who was currently looking at the table with the expression of a man thinking about something unrelated to the conversation, and made a decision that he had been building toward since the meeting began. He said that he could not currently offer Saitama a way home, because the means by which Saitama had arrived were unknown, and the Imperium's methods of transit between locations were not designed to accommodate unknown origin points, but that if Saitama was willing to remain in communication while Eisenhorn's people investigated the question, and willing to refrain from intervening in ongoing conflicts unless directly attacked, he would commit the Inquisition's resources to finding an answer. Saitama looked up from the table and asked if the second condition meant he had to watch people getting hurt without doing anything, because he was not really comfortable with that. Eisenhorn said no, self-defense and defense of civilians were both acceptable. Saitama said okay, that was fine then, he could work with that. He paused, and then asked if there was food available because the trip here had been long. Eisenhorn had prepared for many outcomes of this meeting. He had not prepared for the one where he ended it by asking his acolyte cadre to find out what the facility's kitchen had available, but he had also spent a century learning to adapt, and he adapted now. In the hallway outside the briefing room, Sten was standing with Ezekiel, and the librarian was looking at the closed door with an expression that Sten had never seen on the Dark Angel's face before, something that on a less disciplined man he would have called awe. He asked what Ezekiel was sensing. The librarian said that he had spent 30 years reading the psychic resonance of everything he encountered, and that the resonance of every person, every place, every significant event left a mark on the warp that a trained psyker could feel like heat from a fire, and that the man in that room had no mark, no resonance, no imprint in the warp at all, despite the things he had done, despite the scale of his effect on the physical world. He said that in psychic terms, Saitama did not exist. He said this was the most frightening thing he had ever encountered in 30 years of encountering frightening things. Sten asked why, specifically. Ezekiel said because it meant the warp didn't know he was here. And when the Chaos Gods found out that the warp didn't know he was here, they were going to want to know why. The Chaos Gods did not think in ways that translated cleanly into anything a human mind could follow. But the closest approximation available was that they noticed things the way a vast ocean notices a stone dropped into it, not through directed attention, but through the disturbance that propagated outward from the point of contact, the ripple that reached every shore eventually and carried with it the information of what had caused it. The disturbance that reached them now was not a ripple, it was the absence of one. Tzeentch, the architect of fate, the changer of ways, the god whose consciousness was woven so completely into the structure of the warp that he perceived every possible future as a simultaneous present, noticed it first because Tzeentch's nature was to notice gaps in patterns, and there was a gap in the pattern of fate that had not been there before, a place where the threads of causality that connected every action to every consequence simply ended, not frayed, not redirected, but ended cleanly. As if something was moving through the tapestry of fate without touching it. The threads around the gap were behaving strangely, bending slightly toward it and then away, the way threads behave around something that has mass but no surface for them to attach to. Tzeentch had looked at this gap with the full weight of a consciousness that had been calculating the future for 10,000 years, and found for the first time in that span that it could not calculate through it. Every projection that included the gap's continued existence produced outcomes that branched into configurations Tzeentch had never seen before, not because they were unlikely, but because they were impossible to assign probability to. The gap did not fit into the mathematics of fate. It was not a variable. It was a constant that the equation had not been built to accommodate. Korn noticed it differently. Korn's awareness was not structured around pattern recognition or calculation, but around the endless ocean of violence that fed him, the constant psychic signal of aggression and bloodshed that rose from every corner of the galaxy where sentient beings killed each other. A signal so consistent, and so vast that it functioned as something like a background tone that the blood god existed within rather than perceived. The anomaly presented itself to Korn as a series of silences within that tone, brief specific moments where a quantity of violence had been committed that should have generated a proportional signal in the warp, and had generated nothing, had fed nothing, had enriched nothing. The deaths on Cadia, on Tarsai's Ultra, on Solace Tertius, these were not small events in terms of the violence involved, and Korn's domain registered violence at scales that made individual battles irrelevant. But the deaths of Chaos Space Marines and Daemon Engine occupants should have resonated specifically, because they were marked, they were his, And when something killed what was his and the warp received nothing from the killing, that was not an absence of signal. That was a refusal. Khorne did not experience emotions in the human sense, but the state he entered upon registering this refusal was the closest thing to it, something between rage and incomprehension, and an imperative that would not be ignored. Nurgle and Slaanesh perceived the anomaly in their own registers and reached their own versions of the same conclusion, which was that something was present in the material universe that the warp could not account for, and that this was not a temporary condition, and that it could not be allowed to persist without some form of response. The 4 responses the Chaos Gods prepared were different in nature and approach, because the Chaos Gods were fundamentally incapable of coordinated strategy, but they arrived at the same target by different routes, and the effect was that within 3 weeks of Saitama's conversation with Eisenhorn in the Medici facility on Delos IV, the warp began doing things it had not done before in any recorded history the Inquisition maintained. The first sign was reported by Brother Ezekiel, who woke from meditation in the early hours of the facility's 3rd night, and sent an emergency communication to Eisenhorn stating that something had changed in the warp's local structure, that the silence around Saitama was still present, but that it had acquired a quality it hadn't had before, a quality he struggled to describe and finally articulated as pressure, as if the warp was now aware of the silence and was pushing against it from the outside. Eisenhorn responded within minutes, dressed and operational, and spent 2 hours with Ezekiel going through the implications. The conclusion they reached was that the Chaos Gods had detected Saitama's presence not through the things he had done, but through the absence of effect those things had on the warp, and that this detection had initiated a response, and that the response was building. Eisenhorn sent a priority communication to Inquisitor Crane of the Ordo Malleus, whose warp monitoring network was the best available tool for tracking what was coming, and received a response within the hour that confirmed it. Warp activity across a wide corridor of the sector was spiking in ways consistent with demonic incursion preparation, multiple incursion vectors, coming from different directions, converging on a central point. The central point was Delos IV. Eisenhorn had 3 hours to make decisions before the first incursion began. He used them. He sent word to Sten to prepare the kill team for defensive operations, while making very clear that the incoming threat was demonic in nature, and that conventional space marine combat doctrine was the appropriate response to everything except the entity currently eating in the facility's kitchen. He contacted the nearest Imperial Guard garrison, a regiment stationed 2 continents away, and invoked emergency inquisitorial authority to demand immediate deployment to his coordinates, knowing the regiment would take at least 18 hours to arrive, and that this was therefore a fact about the future rather than a usable resource for the present. He drafted and sent a communication to the Ordo Malleus requesting Grey Knight support, which was the correct response to a confirmed demonic incursion of this scale, and received an automated acknowledgement that told him Grey Knights were en route from their nearest deployment, but would not arrive for approximately 40 hours. He had the perimeter reinforced and the facility's void shields, which it had because Eisenhorn had specified this as a condition of using it, brought to full power. And then he went to find Saitama. He found him where he had been finding him consistently over the past 3 days, which was wherever the food was, currently seated in the kitchen with a bowl of something the acolyte who cooked for the cadre had improvised from local ingredients, and which Saitama had described as not bad, actually. Eisenhorn sat down across from him and explained the situation without softening it, because he had decided on the first day that Saitama responded better to direct information than to managed framing. He said that the Chaos Gods, the fundamental dark powers that shaped the malevolent half of the universe's metaphysical structure, had detected Saitama's presence and were sending representatives, and that those representatives were going to arrive at this location within hours, and that their goal was almost certainly to analyze or acquire the source of the disturbance in their domain, rather than to engage in conventional combat. and that this was therefore a different kind of situation from the ones Saitama had encountered before. Saitama listened to all of this attentively, finished a spoonful of the bowl, and asked what representatives meant in this context. Eisenhorn said that they would likely take the form of powerful demonic entities, physical manifestations of chaos energy, beings that existed simultaneously in the material world and the warp. Saitama said, "Oh, like monsters then." Eisenhorn said yes, broadly speaking, like monsters, but monsters that were sustained by a psychic dimension he couldn't interact with directly through physical force. Saitama looked at him with a patient expression and said that he had dealt with monsters that had said things like that before, and the part where they turned out to be wrong about the physical force thing was usually pretty quick. Eisenhorn looked at him for a long moment and said that he hoped Saitama was right, and meant it more sincerely than he had meant anything in recent memory. The first demonic incursion tore open on the facility's eastern perimeter 11 minutes later, a wound in reality that spilled cornate demons into the Delos IV night in a wave of brass and blood and screaming, and the kill team engaged immediately with the disciplined violence of elite warriors who had trained for exactly this, and held for 4 minutes before the second incursion opened on the western side simultaneously, and then the third on the northern approach. And the void shields were holding, but their capacity was finite, and Eisenhorn was managing 3 separate engagement reports at once when the facility's internal sensors registered movement in the courtyard, and he looked at the feed and saw Saitama standing in the middle of the courtyard, hands in his pockets, watching the chaos with the expression he had come to recognize as the grocery store line, waiting to see if this was going to require his attention. The answer came in the form of a greater demon of corn, a bloodthirster of the highest tier, descending from the tier in reality on the eastern perimeter, with the physical presence of a being that had destroyed space marine companies and broken planetary defenses, and it looked at Saitama across the courtyard, and made the sound that greater demons made when they identified a target, and Saitama looked back at it, and for just a moment the night went very still. And then the sound of a single punch was heard across a radius that Eisenhorn's instruments later calculated at 8 kilometers. The Bloodthirster's destruction was not like the destruction of the Chaos Space Marines on Cadia, or the Tyranid bioforms on Tarsai's Ultra, or the Daemon Engines on Solace Tertius, and the difference was not a matter of scale, though the scale was different too. The difference was that a bloodthirster was not merely a physical entity. It was a projection of Khorne's will into the material world, a concentration of warp energy so dense and so purposefully structured that it had physical form, physical mass, physical presence, but its existence was rooted in the warp the way a tree is rooted in soil. And when Saitama's punch connected with it, the force did not merely destroy the physical manifestation. It transmitted, down through the roots, into the soil. The warp felt it, not as a signal or a communication, but as a fact, the way the ground feels an impact not because the ground has nerves, but because it is a medium and force travels through media. And what traveled through the warp in the moment of that punch was something the warp had no framework for receiving, a kinetic event so absolute and so entirely outside the psychic spectrum that it passed through the warp substance without being absorbed or deflected or transformed. The way a frequency can pass through a material that has no resonance for it, and the result on the warp side was the equivalent of a massive, silent shockwave propagating outward from the point of contact, not destroying anything, not reshaping anything, just passing through everything, and leaving behind it a quality of silence that was different from the silence before. Brother Ezekiel experienced this directly, which was not something he had been prepared for, and which put him on his knees on the facility's eastern corridor floor for approximately 40 seconds. He described it afterward, in the formal librarian's incident report that would eventually be reviewed by the chief librarian of the Dark Angels, and then forwarded to the Grey Knights, and then classified at a level that meant almost no one would ever read it, as the sensation of the warp flinching. Not retreating, not responding with force, Flinching, the way a living thing flinches from something that surprises it, involuntary and instantaneous and immediately suppressed, but real, and he had felt it with 30 years of trained psychic senses, and he was certain of what he had felt. The warp had been surprised by that punch, not by the entity's existence, which it had been aware of and was actively responding to, by the punch specifically, by the quality of the force. As if it had expected something it knew how to process, and received something it did not. On the facility's courtyard, the aftermath of the punch was more straightforwardly physical. The bloodthirster was gone. Not banished in the conventional demonic sense, which would have returned it to the warp in a degraded but persistent form that would eventually reconstitute, but gone in a way that Ezekiel, when he recovered and reached the courtyard, and extended his senses toward the absence where the demon had been, described as something he had never encountered before. The psychic imprint of the bloodthirster, the residue of warp energy that even a banished demon left behind in the material world, was not present. There was no echo, no trace, no fragment of the connection back to Khorne's domain. Whatever Saitama's punch had done to it, it had done it to all of it simultaneously, the physical form and the warp root together, and the result was not banishment but something considerably more complete, for which Ezekiel noted in his report that he did not have the correct theological vocabulary and was therefore leaving the characterization to his superiors. Saitama stood in the courtyard and looked at his fist. He opened and closed it once, the way someone tests a joint that they suspect might have stiffened, and then put his hand in his pocket. The other demonic incursions were still active on the facility's perimeter, and the kill team was still fighting them, and he could hear the sounds of it clearly. He walked toward the eastern perimeter, not running, not moving with urgency, but with the deliberate direction of someone who has decided that the most efficient path from where they are to where they need to be is a straight line. He went through the facility's eastern wall rather than the door, not violently, but because the door was in the wrong part of the straight line, and the wall was just a wall, and emerged on the other side into the active engagement zone, where Sten's kill team was holding a defensive line against a second wave of Khornate demons that had poured through after the bloodthirster, lesser entities but numerous. And the kill team was holding, but the word holding was doing a lot of work in that assessment. What happened over the next 6 minutes was something that every surviving member of Kill Team Obsidian would spend considerable time attempting to describe in their respective after-action reports, and the descriptions would share certain consistent elements while differing significantly in emphasis depending on the individual's psychological relationship with what they had witnessed. The consistent elements were: Saitama moved through the demonic host without apparent tactical consideration, not flanking, not using cover, not coordinating with the kill team's existing defensive structure, simply walking in the direction of whatever was there and addressing it. The addressing was consistently a single punch per target. The targets ranged from bloodlitters, which were roughly space marine-sized demonic infantry, up to a second bloodthirster that had partially manifested through the incursion tier, and which he hit before it had fully entered the material world, which had the interesting effect of closing the incursion tier from the inside out as the bloodthirster's warp root was severed by the impact. The kill team's Vox traffic during this period, reviewed later by Eisenhorn in its entirety, was notable for a gradual shift in register from the clipped, professional combat communications of elite soldiers managing an active engagement to something quieter and more observational, as the kill team members processed in real time that they were no longer the primary combatants in this engagement, and adjusted their operational role accordingly. The western and northern incursions had produced different demonic varieties, Tzeentchian constructs on the north and Slaneshi entities on the west, because the Chaos gods were not coordinating but were each sending their own representatives through their own channels, and this variety meant that when Saitama finished with the eastern engagement and moved to the northern perimeter, he encountered something structurally different from the Khornate entities, a Lord of Change, one of Tzeentch's greater demons. which was a being of immense psychic power, and which presented the most intellectually complex demonic threat the Inquisition's doctrine recognized. It did not immediately attack. It looked at Saitama with the many-faceted intelligence of a creature that had spent millennia calculating outcomes, and it spoke, because Lords of Change were capable of speech and often preferred it to combat in opening exchanges. And it said, in a voice that resonated across multiple psychic frequencies simultaneously, that Saitama was an interesting problem. Saitama said that people kept saying things like that. The Lord of Change said that Tzeentch's gaze could not find him, that the threads of fate moved around him without touching him, that he was a gap in the great plan, and asked how this was possible. Saitama said he didn't know. He'd been told he trained too hard and something broke, but he'd never been totally clear on the details. The Lord of Change was quiet for a moment that felt, to Ezekiel who was observing from the facility's north wall, like a very large and very intelligent mind encountering a variable that crashed its calculation. And then it said that Tzeentch found this unacceptable. Saitama said that was kind of Tzeentch's problem then. The Lord of Change attacked with the full complement of Tzeentch's psychic arsenal, reality-bending energies that had unmade entire space marine companies. And Saitama stood in the middle of it looking mildly uncomfortable the way a person looks when someone is talking loudly in a quiet space, and then punched once, and the Lord of Change was gone in the same complete way the bloodthirster had been gone. And the psychic energies it had been channeling inverted and collapsed inward, and the incursion tier on the northern perimeter sealed itself. The Slaneshi entities on the western perimeter had apparently observed all of this through whatever senses they possessed and had made a collective decision. Because when Saitama reached the western perimeter, the incursion was still active, but the entities that had come through it were no longer advancing. They were doing something that Sten, arriving at the western perimeter simultaneously, would describe in his report as the closest thing to confusion he had ever seen on a demonic face. They had come through their incursion with a very specific purpose, which was to identify the source of the warp disturbance and understand it, because understanding was Slanesh's domain as much as sensation was, and what they were experiencing in Saitama's presence was a complete absence of the psychic information that they used to understand things, a wall of silence where there should have been a rich tapestry of experience and sensation and memory to read. And they were standing in front of this wall of silence with the frustrated incomprehension of beings for whom the inability to perceive something was not a normal state. Saitama looked at them, assessed that they were not currently attacking and were not going to attack, and stood there for a moment. Then he asked, because the situation seemed to call for it, whether they were lost too. The Slaneshi entities stared at him. The incursion tear behind them pulsed once and then closed, and they were pulled back through it in the same motion, and then the western perimeter was quiet. Eisenhorn stood in the facility courtyard in the aftermath and conducted an assessment that took approximately 10 minutes and produced a conclusion he had been building toward for days. The Chaos Gods had sent 3 greater demons and multiple waves of lesser entities against this location, and every one of them had been destroyed or repelled. The demonic incursions had been sealed. The facility was intact. Kill Team Obsidian had sustained 0 fatalities and 4 injuries, all from the initial engagement before Saitama had intervened, none afterward. And Saitama was sitting on the low wall in the courtyard, eating a ration bar that one of the acolytes had given him, looking at the sky with the slightly unfocused expression of a man whose mind was somewhere else. And the warp around him was, according to Ezekiel's report, quieter than it had been at any point since the tracking mission began. Not the pressure quiet of something being suppressed, the genuine quiet of something that had decided, for the moment, to wait. Eisenhorn knew what that meant. The direct approach had failed. The Chaos Gods would not send the same kind of response twice. What came next would be something different, something that operated on a different level than physical demonic assault, and he needed to be ready for it before it arrived. he also needed to be honest with himself about something he had been resisting since the beginning of this investigation. The Inquisition could not control this. The question was no longer whether Saitama could be managed within imperial systems. The question was what happened to the galaxy if the Chaos Gods decided to escalate past the level of direct demonic engagement, and whether Saitama, who was sitting on a wall eating a ration bar and thinking about his apartment, was going to be in the right place when they did. There was a period of 11 days after the assault on Delos IV where nothing happened, and the nothing was worse than everything that had come before it. Eisenhorn had been in the Inquisition long enough to understand that silence from chaos was not peace. Chaos did not exhaust itself. It did not regroup in the conventional military sense, because it was not limited by resources or logistics or the physical constraints that govern material armies. When chaos went quiet, it was because it was preparing something that required preparation, and the length of the preparation was directly proportional to the scale of what was being prepared. 11 days of silence, following an assault that had involved 3 greater demons and multiple simultaneous incursion events, meant that whatever came next was going to be significantly larger in kind rather than just in scale. And the distinction mattered enormously because scale was something that imperial forces had doctrine for, and kind was something that had to be improvised. Eisenhorn spent the 11 days preparing as effectively as he could while privately accepting that preparation had limits when you did not know what form the threat was going to take. The Grey Knights arrived on the 5th day of the silence, a full brotherhood of 12 warriors under the command of Grand Master Aldrich Vorth, a man who had spent 60 years fighting demonic incursions across every sector of the Imperium, and who stepped off his Thunderhawk gunship and immediately requested a full briefing and a private conversation with the entity in that order, which told Eisenhorn that Vorth had read the preliminary reports carefully and had already formed an opinion he was not ready to share. The briefing took 3 hours and Vorth listened to all of it without expression, asking precise, specific questions at intervals that suggested he was building a model in his mind rather than gathering facts sequentially. At the end of the briefing, he sat quietly for a moment, and then said that the part he found most significant was not what Saitama had done to the greater demons, but what Ezekiel had reported feeling in the warp when it happened, and specifically the word flinching, and asked if Ezekiel was available to elaborate. He spent an hour with Ezekiel and then another hour alone, and when he emerged, he found Eisenhorn and said 4 words that Eisenhorn replayed in his memory many times over the following weeks. This changes the theology. Vorth's private conversation with Saitama lasted 40 minutes. Eisenhorn had not been present but had reviewed the transcript, which was remarkable primarily for the quality of Vorth's attempts to explain the nature of the Chaos Gods and the warp to someone who had no existing framework for either, and for the quality of Saitama's responses, which consistently reframed the information Vorth was providing in terms of his own experience in ways that were simultaneously less sophisticated and more direct than Vorth's framing. When Vorth explained that the Chaos Gods were ancient beyond human comprehension, entities whose existence predated the Imperium, Saitama said that he had fought things that were old and big before, and that being old and big didn't necessarily mean anything by itself. When Vorth said that the Chaos Gods existed in a dimension that physical force could not reach, Saitama said that his punch had seemed to reach something in that direction based on what the librarian had told him, and asked whether Vorth had considered that maybe physical force and psychic force weren't as separate as everyone seemed to assume. Vorth had been quiet for a moment, and then said that this was a significant theological point, and that he was going to need to think about it. Saitama said that was fine, take your time. The 11th day's silence ended at approximately 3 hours before dawn local time, and it ended not with a demonic incursion, but with something that Crane's warp monitoring network had never recorded before, and that the instruments had initially flagged as a sensor malfunction, before three independent systems confirmed it simultaneously. The warp across a region spanning approximately 12 star systems had begun to thin. Not in the way it thinned near blanks or pariahs, which created local suppression of psychic activity, and not in the way it thinned near certain Xenos technologies that interfered with warp propagation. It was thinning the way a membrane thins when pressure is applied to it from one side, becoming more present rather than less, the warp pushing harder against the boundary between itself and the material universe across an enormous area, and the effect was beginning to manifest in physical symptoms on every inhabited world within the affected region. Psychers were going mad. Navigation became unreliable. The background psychic noise that every astropathic choir filtered continuously became a roar that overwhelmed filtering capacity. On 3 worlds within the region, warp rifts opened spontaneously without any of the precursor demonic activity that normally preceded them, just direct tears in reality driven by the pressure of the warp pushing through. This was not a demonic assault. This was the chaos gods attempting to restructure the local conditions of reality to eliminate the advantage Saitama's warp silence gave him, to saturate the material universe with warp energy to the point where the silence was drowned out rather than isolated and identified. It was, Eisenhorn understood with a cold clarity that he immediately shared with Vorth, a fundamentally different category of threat than anything that had come before, because it was not targeting Saitama directly. It was targeting the universe around him. It was an attempt to change the environment rather than defeat the individual, which meant the consequences of it were not limited to Saitama, and were not going to stop when Saitama responded. Vorth's Grey Knights deployed immediately to the worst of the spontaneous warp rifts, the 3 worlds where reality had already torn, because closing those rifts was the first priority and it was work Grey Knights were built for. The Brotherhood split into 3 4-man teams and was gone within the hour, and Eisenhorn was left with Kill Team Obsidian and his acolyte Cadre and Saitama, who had been woken by the alert and had come to the situation room looking slightly annoyed at the hour, and had listened to the briefing with increasing attention as it became clear that this was a different category of problem. When Eisenhorn finished, Saitama asked what was happening to the people on the worlds where the warp was coming through. Eisenhorn said that they were experiencing severe psychic disturbance, that in many cases it was fatal, particularly for unprotected psychers, and that the structural integrity of reality on those worlds was degrading in ways that would become irreversible if the pressure continued long enough. Saitama said how long. Eisenhorn consulted Crane's latest projections, and said between 40 and 70 hours before the first world reached the point of no return, depending on the rate of pressure increase. Saitama said that seemed like not very long. Eisenhorn said that was correct. There was a pause, and then Saitama asked whether punching the source of the pressure would help. Eisenhorn said that the source was the Chaos Gods themselves, and that the Chaos Gods existed entirely within the warp, not in the material universe, which meant there was no physical location in real space where they could be accessed directly. Saitama said that he had noticed that his punches seemed to go somewhere beyond the physical based on what had happened to the demons, and asked whether that was right. Eisenhorn said he believed so, based on Ezekiel's observations. Saitama said then the question was whether he could punch toward the source through the thinning areas, where the boundary between the warp and real space was becoming permeable, and whether that would push back on the pressure rather than through it. Eisenhorn stared at him for a moment and then looked at Ezekiel, who was standing in the doorway of the situation room, and Ezekiel's expression was the expression of a man whose entire theoretical framework was being restructured faster than he could track the implications. The librarian said, very slowly, that he did not know. He said that no one had ever attempted to interact with the warp boundary through application of physical force from the real space side, because no force available to any entity in the material universe had previously been capable of reaching the warp boundary. He said that in theoretical terms, If the boundary was thinning under pressure from the inside, a counterpressure from the outside might slow or reverse the process. He said he was speculating at the edge of everything he knew. Saitama said that was okay. He had done most of his best work at the edge of things. He was ready to leave within 10 minutes, which was how long it took for a Thunderhawk to be prepped for launch, and he stood on the landing pad while the engines cycled up and looked at Eisenhorn with an expression that had something new in it. Not urgency exactly, because urgency implied anxiety and Saitama did not appear to be anxious, but purpose, the particular focused quality of someone who has finally identified a problem that requires them specifically and has aligned themselves toward it. He asked Eisenhorn one question before boarding. He asked whether if this worked, it would hurt the Chaos Gods or just push them back. Eisenhorn said honestly that he did not know. Saitama said that was also okay, but that he had been hitting things that should not be hittable for a long time, and that in his experience, even when a thing survived being hit, it remembered being hit, and that sometimes that was enough. Eisenhorn watched the Thunderhawk lift off into the pre-dawn dark and thought about that sentence for a long time afterward, and found that it had the quality of something true. The warp pressure continued to build across the 12-system region as the Thunderhawk flew toward the first thinning point, and on the worlds within that region, people who had no understanding of what was happening above them were experiencing the symptoms of it in the dark, and the gray nights were closing rifts as fast as they could, and the clock that Crane's projections had established was running. And everything that happened next was going to happen in the next 40 hours, or it was not going to happen in time. The first thinning point was above a world called Varantis, a mid-sized agri-world whose only strategic significance was that it sat at the geographic center of the affected 12-system region, which made it the point of highest warp pressure concentration, and therefore the place where the boundary between real space and the warp had degraded the furthest. The Thunderhawk broke atmosphere above Varantis at dawn local time, and Eisenhorn, monitoring from the facility on Delos IV through the ship's sensor feed, could see the thinning on his instruments as a visual distortion in the upper atmosphere, a quality of wrongness in the light that cameras captured as a subtle but consistent warping of the background star field, as if the space above Varantis was slightly out of focus in a way that was not a sensor artifact, but a physical property of the region. The atmospheric distortion was the visible symptom of a warp boundary that had been compressed to approximately 1/3 of its normal thickness by the sustained pressure from the other side, and Crane's latest reading indicated it was still compressing at a rate that put the point of irreversible breach approximately 26 hours away from this moment. Below this distortion, on the surface of Varantis, the planet's resident psyker population was experiencing the consequence of being in close proximity to a warp boundary under that kind of strain. The Astra Telepathica had an astropathic choir of 12 stationed at the planet's administrative center, and 8 of them had already lost consciousness from psychic overload, and 3 more were deteriorating. The surviving member of the choir had sent a distress signal through the only method still available to her, which was manually operated vox rather than astropathic projection, because projecting psychically into the current local conditions was equivalent to shouting into a hurricane. Saitama stood in the open crew bay of the Thunderhawk as it held position in the upper atmosphere. The hatch opened to a sky that looked and smelled wrong in ways that did not translate into any specific sensory complaint, but produced a persistent low-level discomfort that the Thunderhawk's pilot, a Deathwatch tech marine named Brother Kale, logged in his operational notes as ambient wrongness, no quantifiable source. Saitama looked at the distortion above him, the place where the sky seemed to fold slightly on itself, and considered it with the evaluating attention he gave to large things that he was trying to understand before deciding what to do with them. He asked Ezekiel, who was in the crew bay beside him and was experiencing the proximity to the degraded warp boundary as a sustained pressure behind his eyes that he was managing through mental discipline, whether the pressure from the other side was consistent or whether it was being actively applied. Ezekiel said it was being actively applied, that he could feel the intention in it, the directed will of powers whose scale of consciousness made the concept of intention barely applicable but whose effect was unmistakable. Saitama said that made sense. He said that from his experience, when something was pushing from the other side, the most effective response was usually to push back at the same point rather than the same area, because pressure distributed across a surface responded differently to a concentrated counterforce than to a distributed one. Ezekiel looked at him for a moment and said that this was correct in psychic theory as well, that the focused application of opposing force at a single point in the warp boundary could create a localized reversal that propagated outward, like straightening a dent in metal from the inside. Saitama said good, that was what he was going to do then. He jumped out of the Thunderhawk. Kale's immediate instinct was to dive after him, which was the instinct of a pilot whose passenger had just departed the aircraft without a parachute at high altitude, and it took him approximately 2 seconds to override this instinct, with the understanding that the passenger in question had arrived on this world by an unknown mechanism that almost certainly did not involve atmospheric safety equipment, had survived multiple engagements that would have reduced a space marine to component parts, and had demonstrated on several occasions that the normal rules of physical vulnerability did not apply. He held position. He watched on the external cameras as the figure in the white cape fell upward, which was not a paradox but a description of what the cameras recorded. Saitama dropped from the Thunderhawk, and then, before gravity had fully established its claim on him, redirected, not with wings or thrusters but with the same complete indifference to physical laws that characterized everything else he did, and moved up toward the distortion in the sky. The camera feed became unreliable as he approached the thinning boundary, the visual distortion intensifying around him until the feed was more artifact than image. But the last clear frame showed him moving toward the point of maximum compression with his right arm, pulled back in a posture that anyone who had been paying attention over the previous weeks would have recognized immediately. What Ezekiel felt in the moment of impact was something he would spend the rest of his life attempting to describe accurately and never fully succeeding. He was a trained librarian with 30 years of psychic discipline, and he had maintained his mental shields against the ambient warp pressure at near full capacity for the entire approach. And the punch that Saitama delivered into the degraded warp boundary broke through every one of those shields simultaneously without targeting them, the way a shockwave breaks windows without targeting glass. Because it was not a psychic event that his shields were designed to intercept, but a physical event at a scale that psychic shields had never been built to account for. He experienced for approximately 4 seconds the direct, unfiltered sensation of the warp boundary from the real space side, which was not something a human mind was designed to process, and which produced in him a sensory experience so far outside normal parameters that it did not record in his memory as an experience, but as an absence of experience, a gap in his recollection corresponding to those 4 seconds. He came back to himself on the floor of the crew bay with Kale's hand on his shoulder, and a persistent ringing in his psychic senses that lasted 3 days. What the instruments recorded was cleaner and more quantifiable. The warp pressure above Varantis dropped by 63% in the moment of impact and continued dropping over the following 4 hours as the reversal propagated outward from the point of contact, the boundary restoring itself to normal thickness as the counterforce pushed the warp back to its natural position. Crane's monitoring network, tracking the effect across the full 12-system region, recorded a cascading restoration that moved outward from Varantis like a wave, the thinning revering everywhere the pressure had been building, the warp retreating from the boundary it had been pressing against across a region of space spanning hundreds of light years. The 3 worlds where rifts had already opened did not close on their own, because open rifts required active intervention rather than passive restoration, and the Grey Knights were already there and continued their work. But the pressure that had been trying to open more rifts ceased, and the rifts that had been forming on 12 other worlds never completed. Saitama came back through the Thunderhawk's open hatch 17 minutes after he had left it, moving with the same unhurried directness as always, and sat down on the crew bay bench, and was quiet for a moment. Kale, who had watched the instrument readouts with the focused attention of someone witnessing something that was going to be in his mission log for the rest of his career, did not say anything. Saitama looked at his hand again, the same checking gesture, opening and closing, and then looked at the sky outside the hatch, which was already clearer, the visual distortion fading as the boundary normalized, the stars becoming distinct again in the brightening dawn. He said, to no one in particular, that there was something on the other side that was very unhappy right now. Kale asked whether unhappy was the right word. Saitama thought about it and said that there was a feeling he got sometimes when he hit something that did not go away and did not stop, and did not admit defeat, but had been made to back up, a particular quality in the resistance, and that what he had felt through the boundary when the punch connected had that quality, something immense and very old being pushed back and knowing it was being pushed back and refusing to accept what that meant. He said that in his experience, things that reacted that way usually tried something different next. Eisenhorn, receiving the sensor data and Kale's live report simultaneously on DLAS IV, was already thinking about what different might mean when applied to entities whose previous attempt had been to restructure the local conditions of reality across 12 star systems. He pulled up the warp monitoring data that Crane's network was now generating in real time and studied the pattern of the retreat, looking for what it told him about the direction from which the next pressure would come, because Saitama had been right. Things that did not admit defeat tried something different, and the Chaos Gods had now attempted direct demonic assault and environmental restructuring, and both had been countered. And the category of options remaining to them was narrowing in a way that was clarifying. The options that remained were not smaller options. They were the ones that the Chaos Gods had declined to use first because they were costly even for entities of their scale, the ones that involved a different order of engagement entirely, the ones at the end of the list that you used when everything before them had failed. What Eisenhorn did not know yet, and what Crane's network would detect in another 6 hours, was that the retreat had not been uniform across the 12-system region. In one location, a specific point in the warp that corresponded to no particular world or landmark in real space, but which Vorth, reviewing the data from the Varantis mission on a Grey Knight strike cruiser en route to the Third Rift world, identified with immediate and grave recognition, the pressure had not retreated. It had concentrated. The Chaos Gods were not pulling back entirely. They were pulling back from the distributed approach and focusing everything on a single point, the way a force that has failed to break a line by spreading along it focuses everything on one breach, and the point they had chosen was not random and was not tactical. It was the place in the warp where the boundary between the material universe and chaos had been thinnest for 10,000 years, the place where the Eye of Terror looked out from the immaterium into real space, and what was concentrating there was not another assault. It was an opening. Something was preparing to come through the eye itself, not as a demonic incursion but as a direct emergence, and what was preparing to come through it was not a greater demon or a demon engine or a chaos lord. Vorth sent his recognition of the signature to Eisenhorn with a 3-word annotation that stripped every professional qualification and careful uncertainty from his vocabulary, and stated his conclusion in the plainest language available: a chaos god. The Eye of Terror had existed for 10,000 years as the most visible scar on the face of the galaxy, a region of space where the boundary between real space and the warp had been permanently destroyed by an event so catastrophic that the wound had never healed, and was not expected to ever heal, a place where demons walked freely and Chaos Space Marines maintained fortresses, and entire systems existed in a state of permanent overlap between the material and immaterial. It had never fully opened. That was the distinction that mattered, the thing that separated its 10,000 years of existence as a contained region of warp overlap from what was beginning to happen now. For 10,000 years it had been a wound with edges, a defined area beyond which the warp boundary held, damaged but present, a membrane stretched thin but unbroken along its perimeter. What Vorth had identified in the data was the beginning of a process that, if completed, would remove the edges. The Eye of Terror was not going to generate another incursion. It was going to expand, and the expansion was not going to stop at any natural boundary, because the force driving it was not a demonic army pressing from inside, but the will of the Chaos Gods themselves, applied directly to the boundary membrane from the warp side, pressing outward along the entire perimeter simultaneously, attempting to tear the wound open so wide that the distinction between inside and outside ceased to have meaning. What this would mean in practical terms was something that every strategic mind in the Imperium, reviewing the data Crane's network had compiled, arrived at independently and refused to say aloud for varying lengths of time before the weight of it became unavoidable. If the Eye of Terror expanded to the scale that the current pressure vectors projected, a region of space encompassing hundreds of inhabited systems would cease to exist as real space and become an extension of the warp. And the people living in those systems would not die in any conventional sense because death required a body and the warp did not preserve bodies. They would simply be incorporated into the immaterium, their physical existence dissolved into the raw psychic material of chaos. And the stars in those systems would become reference points in a dimension where the laws of physics had no jurisdiction. The Imperium had contingency doctrines for planetary losses, for sector losses, for the loss of entire subsectors in catastrophic engagements. It did not have a doctrine for the loss of a region of space this size, because the people who wrote the contingency doctrines had operated on the assumption that some events were too large to plan for, and the appropriate response to them was to prevent them rather than survive them. Eisenhorn reached Saitama by Vox as the Thunderhawk was returning from Varantis, because there was no time to wait for the return, and the information could not be held. He laid it out in the same direct way he had used throughout. No softening, no management, just the facts in sequence. The Chaos Gods had changed their approach. They were attempting to expand the Eye of Terror directly. The timeline on the expansion reaching irreversible threshold was being calculated, but early projections indicated between 18 and 36 hours. The consequences of completion were the permanent loss of hundreds of inhabited systems, and the mechanism driving it was direct divine rather than demonic agency, which meant that the Grey Knights closing rifts and Eisenhorn's perimeter defenses and every other conventional Imperial response currently deployed was not addressing the actual problem. There was a silence on the Vox for a moment after he finished, and then Saitama said that the Eye of Terror was a place and asked where it was. Eisenhorn gave him the coordinates relative to their current position. Another silence, slightly longer, and then Saitama said that was far. Eisenhorn said yes, it was. Another pause, and then Saitama said that he had been moving fairly fast between locations since he arrived here, and asked whether the Thunderhawk could get him there in time. Eisenhorn said the Thunderhawk could not, that the Eye of Terror was outside the range of any sublight craft within the available timeframe, and warp transit was unreliable in the current conditions, and even at maximum safe warp speed would require longer than the projected threshold. Saitama said him. Eisenhorn said he was sorry that he did not have a solution to the transit problem. Saitama said that was okay, he might. What Saitama did over the following 40 minutes was something that Kale recorded on the Thunderhawk's external cameras, and that Eisenhorn reviewed afterward, with the focused attention of someone trying to determine where, in his understanding of physics, to file what he was seeing. Saitama stood in the open hatch of the Thunderhawk at high altitude above Varantis, looking in the direction of the Eye of Terror, which was not visible in any conventional sense from this position, but which he appeared to be orienting toward nonetheless, in the way that someone orients toward a sound they can hear but not see. He stood like that for approximately 30 minutes, and then he crouched, which was the preparation posture that the kill team had learned to recognize. And then he jumped, and the Thunderhawk's cameras tracked him for approximately 4 seconds before losing him, not because he passed out of camera range, but because he was simply moving faster than the cameras could follow, and the sensor array registered a brief but massive kinetic displacement in the atmosphere above the craft, and then nothing. And he was gone. The jump covered the distance to the Eye of Terror in a way that Ezekiel, when he recovered enough to analyze the data, could only describe by saying that Saitama had not used warp transit, had not used any known FTL mechanism, had not bent space or bypassed physics through any recognizable technique, but had simply jumped hard enough that the question of distance became temporarily irrelevant. The physics of this were not available for analysis, because the physics of this did not fit into any framework Ezekiel had access to. And he noted this in his report with the weary resignation of a man who had been filing reports of this nature for several days, and had come to accept that the word unprecedented was going to appear in his documentation with a frequency that would make his superiors question his vocabulary. Vorth's Grey Knight Strike Cruiser Blade Eternal was en route to the Third Rift world when its sensors registered the approaching signature, and Vorth came to the bridge personally when his officer of the watch reported an unknown contact closing on their position at a velocity that the sensors were declining to quantify, because the number they were generating was not compatible with their operational parameters. Vorth looked at the sensor display for a moment, and then said that he knew what that was, and to open a hailing channel immediately. The hailing channel connected, and Saitama's voice came through with the quality of someone using a piece of technology they have been shown how to operate but are not entirely comfortable with, slightly too loud, slightly too careful with the pronunciation of the channel activation protocol he had been briefed on before leaving Delos IV. He said that he was heading toward the Eye of Terror and asked whether Vorth wanted to go there too. Vorth said yes, he absolutely did, and began giving his crew orders before the channel had fully closed. The Blade Eternal reached the outer perimeter of the Eye of Terror 6 hours later, having pushed its warp drives beyond rated capacity in a way that would require significant Mechanicus attention afterward, and what the sensors showed on arrival was the expansion in progress, visible to real space instruments as a slow but accelerating distortion of the boundary region. The perimeter of the eye spreading outward in all directions simultaneously at a rate that had increased since Crane's initial projection, and was now tracking toward the lower end of the threshold timeline, closer to 18 hours than 36. The warp distortion at the boundary was intense enough to affect the Blade Eternal systems even at the distance Vorth had ordered them to hold, the void shields fluctuating, and the navigational systems registering the kind of interference that preceded complete unreliability. Vorth stood on the bridge and looked at the data and accepted with the professional equanimity of a man who had spent 60 years fighting chaos that what he was looking at was a thing that could not be stopped by any force the Imperium could bring to this location in the available time. Saitama stood on the Blade Eternal's forward observation deck and looked at the Eye of Terror through the reinforced viewport, and this was the first time since arriving in this universe that something he was looking at had given him pause in a way that was not boredom or mild inconvenience but something closer to genuine attention. It was large. He had dealt with large things before, but this was large in a way that was different from a large monster or a large machine, because it was not a thing in space but a quality of space itself, a region where the background character of the universe had been changed, and the change was visible as a depth in the boundary between normal space and whatever was beyond it, a depth that suggested immensity in dimensions he could not directly observe. He stood looking at it for a long time, and Vorth, who had come to stand beside him, did not speak, because he understood that the moment was being processed and that the processing required the time it was taking. Then Saitama said, quietly and to himself in a way that was not directed at Vorth, but that Vorth heard clearly because the observation deck was otherwise silent, that this was going to be different. Not harder, necessarily, just different, because he was not hitting a thing, he was hitting a condition, a state that something very large and very old was actively maintaining with its full attention, and what he needed to do was not destroy it but interrupt it. Break the concentration behind the push the way you could break someone's grip, not by being stronger than their grip, but by disrupting the focus that maintained it. Vorth said, very quietly, that this was a precise understanding of the theological mechanism involved, that the expansion was sustained by directed divine will rather than raw power, and that interrupting the direction was theoretically more effective than opposing the power. Saitama said that made sense. He asked Vorth if there was a specific point in the boundary where the direction was most concentrated, the way a grip had a thumb. Vorth consulted with his librarians for 4 minutes and came back with coordinates, a specific location in the eye's perimeter, where the expansion force was most coherent and therefore most vulnerable to disruption. Saitama took the coordinates, confirmed he understood them relative to his current position, and then said that Vorth should probably move the ship back a considerable distance. Vorth asked how considerable. Saitama said he was not entirely sure, but that his experience suggested that, when something this large responded to being hit at its concentrated point, it responded with a certain amount of general force in all directions, and that the radius of that response was difficult to predict in advance. Vorth moved the blade Eternal back 3 times the distance Saitama had indicated, because 60 years of fighting chaos had given him a very reliable instinct for what difficult to predict in advance meant in practice. Saitama went out through the airlock without a void suit, because a void suit was not a category of equipment that applied to him, and stood in the vacuum outside the hull, and looked at the Eye of Terror from the closest position any living human being had stood in relation to it, while retaining enough cognitive function to form an intention, and oriented himself toward the coordinates Vorth had given him, and was still for a moment in the way he was always still just before, and then he moved. The Blade Eternal's sensors registered the impact point simultaneously with every warp monitoring instrument within 6 star systems, and what they registered was not an explosion or an energy discharge or a psychic event, but the same thing Ezekiel had felt above Varantis, the same absolute kinetic fact passing through the warp boundary and transmitting into the immaterium beyond. Except this time not through a thinned boundary under pressure, but through the oldest and most reinforced tier in the fabric of reality that existed, the wound that had not healed in 10,000 years, and the force that passed through it was not scaled to a degraded boundary, but to what Saitama had determined, standing in the vacuum looking at the eye, was the correct amount, and the correct amount was everything. The response from the other side was immediate and total and felt across every psychic sense within 100 light-years as a sound that was not a sound, a sensation of something immense shifting, and then the expansion stopped. Not slowed, stopped. The boundary held. And in the silence that followed, every psyker in the region, every astropath, every librarian, every warp-sensitive being within the affected area felt the same thing simultaneously. The concentrated divine will that had been pressing against the eye's perimeter had been interrupted, and in the interruption there was something that those who reported it afterward all described with the same word, regardless of their training or background or species, a word that no one expected to apply to a chaos god, and that none of them had a better word for: surprise. The Eye of Terror did not close. That was the first thing Eisenhorn confirmed when Crane's monitoring network stabilized enough to give reliable readings, and it was the first thing he reported to the inquisitorial conclave that had assembled on an emergency basis aboard the Sword of Cogitation, 6 hours after the impact event. And it was the first thing that every strategic mind reviewing the data needed to understand before any other understanding was possible. The Eye of Terror had existed for 10,000 years and would continue to exist, because what had occurred above its perimeter was not a repair and was not a sealing and was not an act of restoration. What had occurred was an interruption, and the thing that had been interrupted had not been destroyed any more than a river is destroyed when a stone is thrown into it. The chaos gods were still there. The warp was still there. The eye was still there. What had changed was everything else, and the nature of the change was the thing that the conclave spent its first 3 hours trying to articulate, and its next 3 hours trying to accept. Vorth presented his findings to the conclave via hololithic link from the Blade Eternal, still positioned at the reduced distance he had ordered during the final approach, and he presented them with the measured gravity of a man who had served the Emperor for 60 years, and had decided that the gravity of this moment required him to say exactly what the data showed rather than what his institutional role suggested he should say. He said that the Chaos Gods had attempted a direct divine emergence, a projection of their will into the material universe at a scale that had no precedent in 10,000 years of imperial history, and that the emergence had been interrupted by a single physical impact delivered by an entity operating entirely outside the warp's domain. He said that the impact had transmitted into the immaterium beyond the boundary, which was itself unprecedented, and that the transmission had disrupted the concentration of divine while maintaining the expansion in a manner consistent with what psychic theorists would call a phase break, a disruption of the coherence required to sustain a focused application of warp energy. He said that the Chaos Gods had withdrawn their concentrated pressure from the eye's perimeter following the impact and had not reapplied it, and that the withdrawal was not a temporary tactical repositioning, but a change in posture that his Brotherhood's best librarian analysts assessed as indicating something they had never expected to be assessing after a conflict with divine entities. He used the same word Ezekiel had used after the Bloodthirster's destruction, the word he had spent 6 days trying to find a more precise theological term for, and had finally accepted was the most accurate one available: caution. The Chaos Gods were being cautious. They had encountered something they did not have a response to, and the response of ancient and immensely powerful entities to encountering something without an answer was not to attempt the same approach repeatedly. It was to evaluate. It was to consider. It was, in the functional sense, to be uncertain for the first time in an existence measured in geological ages, an uncertainty in an entity that had operated for 10,000 years on the basis of absolute dominance over any force it chose to engage, was not a small thing. It was a restructuring of the entity's operational model, and restructuring at that scale took time, and during that time the posture was defensive rather than expansive, and the galaxy was, in a very specific and very fragile sense, quieter than it had been in 10,000 years. The conclave debated for 6 more hours about what to do with this information, and reached a conclusion that Eisenhorn had privately anticipated before the debate began, which was that they were not going to do anything with it publicly. The information was to be classified at the highest available level, and shared with a restricted list of parties that included the Grey Knights, the Deathwatch command structure, the relevant chapter masters, and a small number of senior administratum officials with a demonstrated need to understand the strategic environment. The reasoning was straightforward, and Eisenhorn agreed with it even as he recognized its limitations. The existence of an entity capable of interrupting a Chaos God's direct action was information that would restructure every power relationship in the Imperium if it became widely known, and the Imperium's stability depended on a set of beliefs about the nature of power, in the galaxy that this information would permanently destabilize. And destabilization of that kind had consequences that were difficult to predict and easy to regret. The Inquisition's foundational mandate was to protect the Imperium not only from external threats, but from information that the Imperium was not structurally prepared to absorb. This qualified. Saitama was not present at the conclave. He was still in the vicinity of the Eye of Terror, and Eisenhorn received a Vox communication from Vorth during the conclave's final hour reporting that Saitama had asked Vorth a question that Vorth thought Eisenhorn should know about. The question was whether Eisenhorn had made any progress on the problem of getting him home, because he had done the thing with the eye, and he was hoping that cleared up any outstanding concerns, and he was still very interested in getting back to his apartment and checking whether anyone had watered his plants. Eisenhorn had listened to this and felt something that in another life he might have recognized as affection, and that he categorized professionally as a significant data point about the entity's motivational structure. He sent back a message through Vorth that said the investigation into the transit question was ongoing, that Saitama's assistance with the recent situation had been noted and was appreciated, and that he was in the process of consulting every available resource in the Imperium's considerable knowledge base for a solution to the origin point problem. He also said that in the meantime, if Saitama was willing to remain in contact, Eisenhorn would ensure he had access to reasonable provisions and safe accommodation on any Imperial world he chose to visit. Vorth relayed this and reported back that Saitama had said okay, that was fine, and had asked whether there were any worlds in the region where the food was good. There were things the Conclave's classification decision could not contain. Some of them were operational facts that had already distributed themselves through the Imperium's communications networks before the classification order could reach them. The Battle of Solace Tertius was already in the military record, and while the official report attributed the Daemon Engine destructions to the Iron Hands Company and the Legio Metallica Titan, Princeps Solander and Sergeant Vreth had both filed supplementary observations that described the unknown entity in terms that did not fit any official category, and those supplements were flagged rather than suppressed, which meant they existed in the record for anyone with appropriate access and sufficient curiosity. The Tarsai's Ultra incident was in Commander Sunth's report, and Sunth was a professional who filed accurate documentation. The Cadian crater analysis was in Thessaly's formal administratum submission. The chain of data was not broken. It was only restricted, and restricted data had a way of moving through the Imperium's vast bureaucratic structure like water through soil, slowly and without announcement, but with considerable persistence. What could not be contained at all was what the Chaos forces knew. The warbands that had been operating across the northern sectors had experienced the same psychic withdrawal of divine pressure that every other warp-sensitive entity had felt when the impact event occurred, and the effect on Chaos operational posture was immediate and measurable. The Black Crusade splinter cells that had been pushing through 3 sectors retracted. The demonic incursions that had been sustaining themselves without reinforcement collapsed. The Chaos Lords who had been coordinating under Vorkin the Unbroken's loose authority stopped coordinating, not because of any Imperial military pressure, but because the background psychic impetus that Chaos operations relied on, the constant directional push of divine will express through the warp, had become irregular and hesitant in a way that their senses registered as wrongness without being able to identify the cause. They knew something had changed. They did not know what. But the knowledge that something had changed propagated through the Chaos networks faster than any communication the Imperium possessed, because the warp carried it directly, and within a week of the Eye event, the pattern of Chaos activity across the affected region had shifted from offensive to evaluative, the same word Vorth had used for the Chaos gods themselves, cascading downward through every level of Chaos organization. Eisenhorn spent 30 days after the conclave doing two things simultaneously. The first was coordinating the ongoing investigation into Saitama's origin point, which involved the Mechanicus's best theoretical physicists, the Inquisition's most experienced specialists in anomalous transit events, and a classified consultation with the Eldar, whose experience with forces operating outside normal warp interaction was the broadest available, and who had their own reasons for wanting to understand what had punched a chaos god in the eye of terror. The Eldar provided information that was useful in ways Eisenhorn was still unpacking a month later, and that confirmed several of his intuitions about the nature of Saitama's arrival, while opening questions about the mechanism that were considerably more complex than the ones it answered. Progress was being made. It was slow progress, but it was directional, and Eisenhorn had spent a century in the Inquisition understanding that directional progress was the only kind that mattered. The second thing he was doing was writing a document that he intended to seal in his personal records and not submit to any official body until he had finished thinking about whether it should exist as a formal submission at all. It was not a threat assessment or an operational report or a strategic recommendation. It was a theological argument, something Eisenhorn had not written before in his career, and its central proposition was this. The Imperium of Man had been built on the premise that the Emperor was the single uncontested supreme power in the material universe, the only force capable of holding chaos at bay and protecting humanity from the warp's entropy, and that this premise required the Emperor to be categorically unique, a singularity, because a universe that contained more than one such force was a universe that operated by different rules than the ones the Imperium's entire ideological structure assumed. What had happened above the Eye of Terror did not disprove the Emperor's supremacy, but it demonstrated that the category of beings capable of operating at that scale was not a category of one, and a category that could contain more than one member was not a category built on uniqueness. It was a category built on something else, something that the Imperium's theology had not named because the Imperium's theology had never needed to name it, and Eisenhorn did not yet know what that something else was, but he was fairly certain it was important, and he was fairly certain that understanding it was the work of the next phase of his career, and possibly his life. Saitama, meanwhile, had found a world called Meridian Secundus in the subsector, adjacent to the Eye's outer boundary, a place that had experienced almost no direct conflict during the recent crisis, because it was small and agricultural and strategically marginal, and which had a local market culture that sold food from open stalls in its principal settlement's central square. He had been there for 2 weeks. He had developed a preference for a specific vendor's flatbread preparation that he described in a Vox check-in with Eisenhorn as genuinely good, actually, not as good as the place he knew back home, but legitimately good, which he said with a quality of satisfaction that Eisenhorn had not heard in his voice before, and that he privately thought was the most positive development of the entire situation. Saitama was not hiding. He was not building power or gathering followers or maneuvering within the Imperium's political structures. He was eating flatbread in a market square on an unremarkable world, and occasionally a local child would ask him about the white cape, and he would explain that it was his hero costume, and the children would ask what a hero was, and he would think about how to explain it in a way that translated, and usually he settled on saying that a hero was someone who showed up when things were bad and tried to make them less bad, and that it was a job he had taken because he wanted to, not because anyone made him, and that he had gotten very good at it even though it was lonely sometimes. The galaxy did not return to normal. The Eye of Terror remained open. The Chaos Gods remained, vast and ancient and undefeated, having retreated into evaluation and uncertainty but not into defeat, and the threat they represented to every living being in the Imperium was not reduced so much as it was paused, a breath held, a calculation running. The wars that had been interrupted resumed in diminished form, as local commanders pursued local objectives without the broader divine impetus behind them. The imperial bureaucracy continued to function with the grinding, eternal momentum of an institution too large and too old to be significantly altered by any single event, however unprecedented. Space Marines still fought. Guardsmen still died. The Astronomicans still burned. The Emperor still sat on the golden throne, sustaining the light that held the warp at bay across a galaxy of 100 billion stars. But somewhere in that galaxy, in every classified report and supplementary observation, and sealed inquisitorial document and whispered exchange between veterans who had been there and couldn't quite stop thinking about it, there was a fact that had not existed before and could not be made to not exist. The Chaos Gods had tried to open the Eye of Terror, and a short man in a white cape had punched the idea back into the warp with one fist and then gone looking for something to eat. The galaxy knew something it had not known before. Not all of it, and not loudly, and not in any form that would survive public scrutiny or official acknowledgement. But the knowledge was there, distributed through the networks of people who had seen it or recorded it or received its data or felt its echo in the warp. And knowledge of that kind, once present, did not diminish. It accumulated. It waited for the moment when the weight of it became too large for any classification level to contain. Saitama sat in the market square on Meridian Secundus and ate his flatbread and watched the people around him going about their lives, and the sky above him was blue rather than red for the first time since he had arrived in this universe, and he thought that it was a good sky, and that he was still going to try to get home, but that while he was here, he might as well do the job, and that the job was the same here as it had always been everywhere. Show up, try to make things less bad, and punch whatever needed punching. He had gotten very good at the last part. He was still working on the rest of it. But then, he thought, finishing the last of the flatbread and looking up at the blue sky, he had always been better at the punching than the rest of it, and somehow the rest of it had always worked out anyway. The Eye of Terror watched from the edge of the galaxy, ancient and patient and changed by something it had not expected to be changed by, and the warp moved around the silence that it could not touch, and the galaxy turned, and somewhere in its turning a bald man in a white cape was deciding whether to have another piece of flatbread, and the answer, it turned out, was yes.